Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we're stitching stippling into one of our spinning square blocks. And the cool thing about this design is we don't have to stitch the block in the ditch to start. So we're going to save some time, we're going to flow and wiggle around, and we're even going to be able to avoid those areas of intense seam allowances by stitching this design in this block. So let me show you the design and some tips to get started. So here's our block and here's our quilting design. And just in case you're looking for this stippling design, if you want to mark it on your block, you can find it in the Building Blocks quilt pattern, and that's available at leahday.com. Okay, so notice I have not marked this design on my quilt block. I am going to freehand stitch this. This is an option that is a very good option for you if you have done some stippling. This is going to be a good idea. It's also a good idea just to simply learn how to move around the block, and if you don't want to stitch over your center square, if you found that stitching over the t-shirt fabric is a little bit of a challenge for you, then you don't have to. The design flows over it. What I design flows over it, but if let's say that this is something that you really want, you want that design to look really kind of cute right there in the center. Well, you can take your stippling and just wiggle it around. You don't have to stitch over this area. So I want you to understand that you don't have to mark it, but that's certainly open to you if you want to. I'm not going to mark it because I want to emphasize two things within this block. Number one, I want to emphasize moving through this in a continuous line without kind of locking yourself into a corner. And the second thing I want to emphasize is stitching in a way that helps us avoid areas where we're going to have a lot of density and intensity from all of those seam allowances within this block. So areas like this, I'm going to show you how you can kind of wiggle around it rather than hitting it exactly. So let's get on the machine and see how this works. Okay, so I'm on the machine, and just in case you need a little review about getting started, I'm going to drop my presser foot, I'm going to drop my needle down into the machine, let me move my hand so you can see, drop my needle down and then bring it up. Now if you don't have a needle up, needle down, just grab your hand wheel and do the same thing. Now I'm going to tug on this top thread, and that brings up a loop. Grab a hold of that loop and pull on it, and that brings your bobbin thread to the surface. And that helps it just not make a mess on the back of your quilt while you're quilting. Okay, so I'm going to start stitching just a little bit off that edge, just to kind of get started, and start removing my pins. Now, I'm going to be generally working in a row, kind of down a little bit, wiggling around from left to right, working through this block. There's a few areas I want to avoid. I want to avoid stitching this area too closely. I don't want to come up here and have to hit that point or this point, any of these points, because those are areas, there's a lot of layers of fabric underneath that point where all of those seams were pressed to one side. So I want to avoid that. So I'm going to wiggle around, and I'm trying to stitch this on a 1/2 inch scale so it's not too dense. But if my lines come closer together or further apart, that's okay too. What I'm concentrating on is just forming in a regular wiggly shape. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. Whenever you feel like you need to, just stop and reposition your hands. See how this start was just a wiggly U shape, and then all I did was add some bends, add some curves, extra curves, and that's what made it more complex. Okay, so now I'm working into this area. Woo! As I was pushing that, did you see the block kind of push up against the presser foot and the needle? I'm going over several seam allowances. If I want to, I have it open to me to lift my presser foot ever so slightly. And I have a little spring on the side, and I can just alter that right there. You might not have that function though. So what do you do in that situation? Well, you can actually manually come here and kind of lift the presser foot with your finger or with a stiletto as you're stitching. Sometimes it helps to just lift it slightly, and sometimes that will bring it up kind of over the hump so it won't impact your quilting. Now I'm going to flow kind of this way, and I decided that I am going to stitch over my fabric, my t-shirt fabric. I want to have that nice and stable. That is a very old scrap of fabric, It's one of Josh's Sigma Nu t-shirts. Notice how I'm even going back in this situation and grabbing the presser foot lifter and lifting it slightly so that way I get over that hump of fabric that's right behind my presser foot. I had a feeling if I just kept stitching over it, it probably wouldn't have worked. I probably would have hit it and it would have just pushed against me again. So here you can see I'm just flowing over. Sometimes I'm finding that my stitches, my lines of quilting are getting a little closer together simply because I'm trying to avoid some area of density, some area of seam allowances. That's okay. It's okay for your lines of quilting to come together a little bit. Now I'm going to kind of head upwards, and see how I avoided that going kind of over that hump of fabric? That's kind of nice. You don't have to stitch over that. Just kind of come up close to it, skim it, but you don't have to stitch over it, and that sometimes makes it a little easier feeling. So at this point, I kind of stitched myself right into that corner. You might not be able to see it because my fabric is black on black right here, but I stitched myself right into the ditch. Well, what do? All you have to do is simply travel stitch along the edge of the block. This is why I work in rows, because if you work in rows and you hit the edge, you can always travel stitch down. If you work in kind of a meandering mess, then you'll end up in the middle of the block and not be able to get out again. So I always like to work logically. Okay, now I'm stitching out again, curving around, just doing some simple wiggly U-shapes. I want to avoid that little area right there, which has lots of seam allowances. I'm generally also stitching downwards because I'm wanting to go from right to left now as I form my next row of this design. Sometimes stitching right to left feels a little tricky for me, personally. It just doesn't kind of make as much sense. So a lot of times I'll rotate the block. It will allow me to more clearly see what I've stitched before, because as I stitch this row, I want to kind of come up and interlock it. I don't want to hit the lines of quilting, I don't want to cross them, but I just want to interlock them a little bit so that it forms a nice, smooth texture. So here I'm kind of coming up, swinging in. It's a lot harder to see my quilting because of this t-shirt fabric. The t-shirt fabric is white on gray and my thread is white, so it's a lot harder to see what I'm doing. I'm feeling a little lost, but that's okay. I can kind of see the texture I'm creating, and if you ever need to just stop and go, okay, where is my stitching again? That's a good thing. Just stop and take a look at it, a close look at it, and figure out where you're going to go next. Okay, now I'm going to wiggle into this area. The nice thing about stitching over the t-shirt fabric area is that there's no seam allowances in it, because it was just one piece of fabric. So that area might feel even easier to stitch. It's hard to say. Okay, at this point I kind of need to just keep an eye out. I have a little patch that I left open, but I'm not going to get too worried about it. I don't think anyone's going to take a ruler to my quilt and point it out to me. Hey Leah, you left a little gap open right there. I'm not going to worry about it. And I'm just wiggling back and forth, coming down. One thing you might have noticed as I stitched that, you see this little, it's almost like a little baggy pleat. It's not a full pleat, I didn't actually stitch it over, but there's definitely some bagginess right there. This is a product, more than anything else, of pressing the seams to one side. Because when you press to one side, you really don't get as crisp a press over, and you're always going to have just a little extra baggy fabric resting along that edge. And so when you go to quilt, you're going to find stuff like that. That's pretty common. I'm not worried about it. It's not bothering me too much. As you can see, I'm sitting here just playing with it, trying to press the fabric around. But I think it's okay. If anything, it's just one of those things that happens whenever you paper piece or whenever you press seam allowances to one side. Okay, so I've got an area here, that corner, I want to avoid that. So you see how I stitched around it. I avoided it by just kind of almost making a ring around it. I stitched all the way around and came inside, and that got a little tight even, just to avoid stitching right through that corner, right through that point. And now I'm just flowing through, stitching a little bit into that T-shirt fabric block and a little bit off. I'm going to have to do one more row to fill up the block completely. As I come off that fabric, I kind of just have to watch out as the fabric wants to kind of pull. And see how there's that much give in the fabric. I'm just pulling downwards with my thumbs and getting a good grip on it as I finish up this little area. That can really help. That can help to eliminate that kind of baggy fabric problem. And so here I'm going to do the same thing. I might have to stitch off the ditch, stitch in the ditch there for just a little while. And now I can wiggle into that corner and start that last row of stitching. So that's it for stitching stippling in a spinning square block. I really hope that you enjoyed learning this design and getting a lot of tips and ideas about avoiding those areas that can be tricky. No doubt about it, these seam allowances can cause some problems in our quilts, but you can avoid them if you stitch an all-over design like stippling. And all-over quilting, I think that it's very important to learn this. We all have quilts that we just want to just quilt it and get it done. And an all-over quilting design will do that. We also have quilts that we want a little bit more time and energy and effort put into the quilting design, and that is open to you too. But don't ever get too hard about stippling. A lot of times I hear quilters say, "Oh, I'll do anything other than stipple." And I can understand where they're coming from. They probably stitched stippling for years and they want to do anything other than that design. I was certainly there at one time too, but I've come around again to see that stippling is a really good design to learn with. And it's a really good design to have in your toolbox for those tricky quilts like this block where you have things that you want to avoid, you have things that you want to wiggle around, and stippling makes that open to you. Now, if you want to learn some more designs like stippling that are not stippling, but they still work like stippling, if that's not confusing enough, check out my family of independent designs. All of these designs work like stippling, but they don't look like stippling. So definitely check those out at the Free Motion Quilting Project, and I'm sure that will stimulate even more creativity and ways for you to finish your quilts. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and learn how to piece and free motion quilt 42 beautiful blocks with me. You can pick up your pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt.